They stood there, frozen, not from the cold, but from the sound. A few broken notes drifted out of an old army radio, slow, warm, and strange. The prisoners didn't move. Some had spent years fighting, killing, and nearly dying for the emperor. Others had lost everything in the name of Japan. But that sound didn't belong in a prison camp. It didn't belong in war at all. It was music. American music. And for the Japanese prisoners of war who heard it for the first time, it felt like their entire world cracked open. See, when we talk about World War II, we usually think about tanks, battles, and the brutal fight across the Pacific. But we rarely talk about the human moments, the quiet, strange ones that don't fit into history books. This story is about one of those moments. It's the story of how a few bars of jazz, floating through the air of a lonely POW camp, shook hardened soldiers to their core and made them question everything they thought they knew about the enemy. Before the war, Japan's government controlled almost everything its people saw or heard. Music wasn't just entertainment, it was propaganda. The Ministry of Home Affairs decided what could be played on the radio, what could be recorded, and what could be sold. Western music, especially from America, was treated like a disease. Jazz and swing were banned for being degenerate. American lyrics were replaced with military songs praising sacrifice, the emperor, and death before dishonor. To the average Japanese citizen, American culture became a ghost, something distant, suspicious, and sinful. Many young men went off to fight, never having heard an American voice, much less a song. So when the empire began to crumble in the last years of the war and soldiers were captured, they carried that mindset with them. The enemy was evil, soulless, mechanical, nothing more. The Allied camps challenged that belief in quiet ways. Life there was hard, but it wasn't what Japanese propaganda had promised. Instead of endless torture and death, some prisoners found themselves fed, clothed, even treated by medics. But the biggest shock wasn't food or kindness. It was the sound. One afternoon, in a camp somewhere in the Pacific, an American guard tuned his radio to a local station. The prisoners heard horns, drums, a rhythm they'd never known before. It was Benny Goodman, maybe, Sing, 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 or Don't Be That Way. They didn't have words for it, but they felt it. Imagine spending your whole life believing your enemy was a monster, then hearing that monster make something joyful, playful, and alive. Some of the men laughed nervously, unsure if it was a trap. Others covered their faces, ashamed to feel something so forbidden. One prisoner later said, "It was like hearing the voice of another world. I realized they were people too." That single broadcast marked a quiet turning point. The guards didn't intend it as an experiment, but it became one. The music humanized the enemy in ways propaganda never could. And that's what this video is about, how a simple song broke through years of fear, lies, and hate. We'll dive into what life was actually like inside those POW camps, what those men had been taught to believe, and how one moment of sound reminded them of something long buried: emotion. Because even in war, the heart doesn't take orders. In the next part, we'll go deeper into the problem how Japan built a wall around its people, cutting off any sound or sight of the outside world, and how that wall shaped everything the prisoners felt when they finally heard American music. Before those Japanese soldiers ever stepped foot in a prison camp, before they ever heard that strange American music drifting through the air, their minds had already been built into cages. You see, Japan in the 1930 seconds wasn't just preparing for war with weapons. It was preparing with ideas. From the moment kids entered school, they were taught one message over and over again: Japan was divine, and everyone else was beneath them. The emperor was not just a leader, he was a god. To die for him was the greatest honor. To surrender was the deepest shame. And everything foreign, especially American, was seen as poison. The government made sure of it. Newspapers, books, radio shows, all censored. Western movies? Gone. American music? Labeled enemy noise. Even words borrowed from English were scrubbed from speech. At home, people sang military songs, instead songs with lyrics about loyalty, sacrifice, and the beauty of dying for your country. Students marched in schoolyards, shouting slogans about the emperor's glory. Posters showed brave soldiers smiling as they ran toward explosions. In that world, jazz wasn't music. It was corruption. The saxophone, the trumpet, they weren't instruments. They were symbols of weakness, of the Western rot that Japan had vowed to destroy. So by the time the war reached its peak, most Japanese soldiers had never heard an American song, not once. They didn't even know what American sound meant. To them, America was a faceless monster that had to be wiped out. This wall of propaganda was powerful. It gave people certainty, purpose. It made them feel like they were on the right side of history. But it also took something away: curiosity, empathy, and even the ability to imagine that someone across the ocean might feel pain the same way they did. Now imagine being one of those soldiers. You're 19, maybe 20. You've been taught your whole life that surrender is worse than death. Then one day, you lose. You're captured. And suddenly, the very people you were told were demons are the ones feeding you. That's not just confusing, that's identity breaking. Inside Allied prison camps, that confusion was everywhere. Japanese POWs were shocked by how differently they were treated compared to what they'd been told. Many of them had been told that Americans tortured prisoners for fun, that they mutilated them, starved them, or used them for experiments. Some were even told that if they surrendered, they'd be executed right after capture. So when they were given blankets, rice, medical care, when guards talked to them like humans, it didn't fit their reality. At first, many refused to eat, convinced the food was poisoned. They wouldn't talk, they wouldn't sleep. They'd stare straight ahead for hours, lost in disbelief. And then, there was the silence. These camps were far from home, thousands of miles away, cut off from everything familiar. The only sound most days was the wind, maybe the distant rumble of trucks. No Japanese voices, no temple bells, no radio speeches, just emptiness. That silence did something strange. It made small sounds stand out: footsteps, laughter, and eventually, when an American guard tuned his set to a local station, it wasn't an act of kindness or cruelty. It was just routine, something to break his own boredom. But for the prisoners, it was like a wall cracking open. For years, the Japanese government had built that wall, a wall of lies, fear, and pride. But here, in the middle of nowhere, it started to fall apart. Because sound, especially music, doesn't need translation. You don't have to speak English to feel swing. You don't need to understand jazz to know that it's alive. What those soldiers didn't realize was that, back in America, that same music had carried its own kind of pain. Jazz was born from struggle, from people who'd known suffering and turned it into rhythm. It wasn't just enemy noise. It was survival turned into sound. And that's what they were hearing. Not propaganda, not power, but people expressing something real. For the first time in their lives, the Japanese POWs were hearing something the war had taken away: emotion. Some said it made them homesick, even though the music was foreign. Others said it made them angry. How could their enemy feel joy while their own families starved back home? But deep down, it also sparked something new: curiosity. Who were these people, really? How could they make something that sounded this free? That moment didn't end the war. It didn't erase hatred overnight, but it planted a seed, one that grew quietly inside the minds of men who had been told their whole lives that the world outside Japan was empty. Now, for the first time, they knew it wasn't. In the next part, we'll go inside the camps, the daily life, the interactions, and the exact moment those prisoners began to change. You'll hear about one particular camp where a single radio broadcast led to one of the most unexpected reactions of the war. Because sometimes, the smallest sound can echo louder than any explosion. The camps were quiet, too quiet. Days blended together: roll call, rations, labor, silence. Most Japanese POWs didn't talk much, not even to each other. They were trapped between shame and survival. Every breath they took was a reminder that they'd failed their country. The guards called them the ghosts. Because they hardly looked alive, they just moved, ate, and obeyed. The camps varied depending on where you were. Some were in Australia, some in the Philippines, others scattered across Pacific islands or even in the US itself. But they all shared the same air tension. Food was basic: rice, bread, sometimes watery soup. The men worked in fields or maintenance crews, fixing fences or cleaning equipment. The Americans kept them busy to stop their minds from breaking. Still, the silence lingered. That silence wasn't just from lack of sound, it was the silence of lost belief. These men had been raised to die for the emperor, yet here they were, alive, fed by their enemy. Then one afternoon in 1944, in a camp near the Solomon Islands, something unusual broke through that silence. An American sergeant, no one remembers his name, had managed to get his hands on a small radio. It was old, crackly, and half-broken. He propped it on a crate and turned the knob until voices and static filled the yard. A few guards stopped to listen. And then it happened. A trumpet blasted through, a steady drumbeat followed. Then came a rhythm that no Japanese ear had ever known, swinging, wild, alive. It was Glenn Miller's In the Mood. The prisoners froze mid-step. Some dropped their tools. They stared at the radio like it was a weapon. At first, the guards laughed. "You guys never heard music before?" one joked. But none of the prisoners smiled. They just stood still, eyes wide, listening. The tune was upbeat, happy, completely out of place in a camp surrounded by barbed wire. It was like hearing sunlight. For a few minutes, the war disappeared. The sound filled the air, soft but unstoppable, weaving between the huts, bouncing off the tin roofs, mixing with the smell of wet dirt and diesel. Some men turned away, ashamed that they liked it. Others tilted their heads, trying to understand how anyone could make something that felt free. One prisoner, a former student named Kenji, whispered, "This isn't enemy sound, this is life." He didn't mean it lightly. Back home, he'd only heard the drum beats of military marches, rigid, predictable, all about control. But this music moved wherever it wanted. It was rebellion. That day became the talk of the camp, not loudly, never loudly, but in quiet exchanges. What was that music? Why do they play like that? Are all Americans like this? The guards, noticing the curiosity, sometimes played more, not out of kindness, but out of boredom. Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald. Each song chipped away at the prisoners' walls a little more. A few weeks later, something remarkable happened. During a work break, a guard started humming one of the jazz tunes. To his surprise, one of the prisoners, a mechanic named Sato, quietly hummed along. The guard stopped, looked at him, and laughed. "You like that?" Sato didn't answer, but he nodded. That small moment, barely a few seconds, meant more than anyone realized. Because in that camp, showing emotion was rare. The Japanese soldiers had been taught that emotion equals weakness. But here, in the middle of enemy territory, a song had made one of them forget that rule. Over the next few months, more music came. Some of it from radios, some from records the guards played at night. Sometimes the prisoners would just sit near the fence, pretending not to listen, but their eyes gave them away. And each time, that invisible gap between us and them shrank a little. There are diaries and reports that confirm this shift. American officers noticed that Japanese POWs who heard Western music regularly were calmer, more cooperative, and less hostile. One camp commander even wrote, "Music reached them where food and words could not." Of course, not everyone accepted it. Some prisoners still turned their backs when the music played, whispering prayers under their breath, trying to block out the sound of the enemy's joy. But even they couldn't escape the feeling that something deep inside had moved. Because that's the thing about music, it sneaks past logic. It goes straight to the heart. One former POW, interviewed decades later, said, "I hated them, but when I heard that song, I felt something I hadn't felt since I left home, peace." He paused, then added, "Maybe that was the day I stopped being a soldier." It's strange, isn't it, that something as simple as a radio and a melody could do what months of war couldn't make men see each other as human again. But that's exactly what happened. Inside those fences, surrounded by guards and wire, jazz became the one thing no one could control. It reminded everyone, even the captors, that life was more than just sides, flags, or orders. In the next part, we'll reach the climax of this story, the key moment when that same music led to something completely unexpected, a performance inside the camp that brought prisoners and guards together, if only for one night. Because in a world built on hate, a single song can sound like freedom. It started with a broken guitar. One of the American guards, a young kid from Texas named Miller, had been lugging it around since boot camp. The thing had a cracked body, only 4 strings left, and a faded sticker of a pin-up girl on the back. Most days it just sat by his bunk, silent. But one humid evening, after a long day of labor, Miller took it out and started to play. Nothing fancy, just a few chords, simple and slow. The sound floated across the camp, soft and uneven, but real. Some of the guards joined in, clapping along. They were off duty, relaxing, laughing about nothing. The prisoners, gathered behind the fence, listened quietly. They didn't understand the song, but they felt its warmth. And then something strange happened. One of the prisoners, the same man who'd once hummed along to Glenn Miller, stepped forward. His name was Sato. He was a mechanic before the war, a quiet man, barely spoke. That night, he raised his hand through the fence and said something in broken English. "Can try?" The guards froze. One of them smirked. "You can play?" Sato nodded. They hesitated, then passed the guitar through the gate. He held it gently, almost reverently, like he was touching something sacred. He plucked a few strings, testing the sound. Then, to everyone's surprise, he began to play a melody soft, simple, but haunting. It wasn't jazz. It wasn't American. It was an old Japanese folk song, Kojo no Tsuki, the moon over the ruined castle. The camp fell silent. Even the guards stopped joking. The tune floated through the night air, slow and mournful, carrying with it a sadness no words could express. The Americans didn't know the song, but they felt it, the weight, the loneliness, the longing. Some later said it was the most beautiful thing they'd heard in the entire war. When he finished, there was a long pause. Then, quietly, someone started to clap. Others joined in. Sato handed the guitar back and bowed slightly, embarrassed. Miller smiled and strummed a few bright chords in return. The moment felt unreal enemies, separated by war, connected through music. That night changed the camp. The next evening, a guard brought out a harmonica. Another found a tin drum. One of the prisoners, who'd once played violin in Tokyo before the war, was allowed to make a makeshift instrument using scrap wire and a wooden box. Slowly, music became part of the camp's life. Not every day, not officially, but often enough that everyone began to notice. And in those moments, something happened that no one could have predicted. Laughter. Real, human laughter, the kind that had been missing for years. The guards saw the prisoners differently after that. They weren't faceless soldiers anymore. They were men, tired, hungry, broken men who missed their homes just as much as anyone else. And the prisoners began to see the Americans not as monsters, but as people. The camp commander didn't like it at first. "This isn't a music club," he barked when he heard about the gatherings. But when he saw how discipline improved, how fewer fights broke out, how the men worked more willingly, he looked the other way. Music had done what orders couldn't. One prisoner later wrote in his diary, "When I played that song, I thought of home. I thought of my mother. I thought maybe the Americans have mothers too. Maybe they also want to go home." He wasn't trying to be poetic. He was just realizing, for the first time, that the people he'd been told to hate were just like him. Another guard, interviewed decades later, said, "It was the first time I forgot they were the enemy. For a few minutes, they were just men making music under the same sky." Think about that for a second. These were people who, months earlier, had tried to kill each other. Now they were sharing melodies, tapping feet to the same beat, humming songs they couldn't even translate. It didn't erase the war, it didn't undo the pain, but it reminded them that the world was bigger than the hatred they'd been handed. News of that camp's music nights even reached other bases. Some officers mocked it, others copied it. There are scattered records from Australia, Hawaii, and Guam, describing similar scenes: guards letting prisoners listen to American broadcasts, prisoners singing old Japanese songs in return. One officer wrote in a report, "Music seems to neutralize bitterness. Even the most defiant."
Do prisoners soften when a familiar tune plays? In the grand scale of war, these moments didn't change the outcome, Japan still surrendered months later. The bombs still fell. The world still burned. But for the men inside those fences, something did change. Because for one fleeting night, the barbed wire didn't matter. The flags didn't matter. Only the sound did. And when the final note faded into the darkness, no one clapped, no one spoke. They just listened to the echo, to the reminder that even in the ugliest corners of war, humanity still found a way to sing. In the next part, we'll explore what happened after the war, how those same Japanese POWs carried that memory home, how it shaped their lives, and why. For many of them, that single night of music became the moment they stopped seeing the world through fear. Because sometimes, the smallest note leaves the loudest echo. When the war finally ended in August 1945, the world felt like it had cracked open. For the prisoners inside those Allied camps, news of Japan's surrender didn't bring joy, it brought silence. Most of them just sat down on the ground and stared at nothing. They had fought for an emperor who said he was divine. They had watched friends die shouting his name. And now that same emperor's voice came through the radio, calm, distant, admitting defeat. To them, it felt like the end of the world. The American guards didn't celebrate much either. Many of them were just tired of death, tired of counting days, tired of pretending not to care about the men on the other side of the fence. For a while, the camp was quiet again. No more music, no more singing, just waiting. Waiting for ships, for orders, for whatever came next. But then, something unexpected happened. One night, as the guards sat smoking near the fence, a soft humming started. At first it was faint, almost drowned by the wind. Then more voices joined in. The melody was familiar. Kojo no Tsuki, the same song Sato had played on the broken guitar weeks earlier. Except this time, it wasn't one man. It was dozens. The entire camp was singing. No instruments, no lyrics in English, just voices, low, haunting, and full of everything they couldn't say out loud. Regret, relief, fear, maybe even hope. A few of the guards stood up, listening. Some took off their caps. One quietly whispered, "They're saying goodbye." That song wasn't just for Japan. It was for the men who never came home, the families they'd never see again. And maybe, in some strange way, for the Americans too, for showing them that the world wasn't as black and white as they'd been told. When the time came to release the prisoners, many of them didn't know what to do. They boarded ships in silence, clutching the small belongings they'd been given, a blanket, a tin cup, sometimes a photo taken in the camp. And for some of them, one other thing, a record. The Americans had started handing out small phonograph records as part of post-war cultural exchange programs. Some included swing, some jazz, some even American folk songs. A few of the prisoners of war asked to take them home. Back in Japan, the reception wasn't warm. Surrendered soldiers were seen as disgraced, cowards who had brought shame to their families. Many avoided talking about their time in captivity. Some never mentioned it again. But deep down, the memory of that music stayed. Years later, when Japan began rebuilding, something strange started happening. Western music, once banned, began to flood the airwaves. Jazz clubs opened in Tokyo. American records sold out in black markets. Young Japanese musicians started forming bands, copying the very rhythms their fathers had once called enemy noise. And among those musicians were former soldiers. One of them was Sato. After the war, he returned to Osaka and worked in a small machine shop. But on weekends, he played guitar at a local cafe. The owner said he'd sometimes hum American songs, quietly, but with a soft smile. In an interview decades later, Sato said, "I don't remember the guard's name, but I remember the sound. It made me feel alive again." He wasn't the only one. Other veterans wrote about that same experience, hearing music in captivity and realizing that emotion wasn't weakness. It was survival. Some even credited those nights in the camps for helping them rebuild their lives after the war. The music reminded them that beauty could exist even after destruction, that not everything the enemy created was evil. Historians often call World War II the war of total hatred. Every side demonized the other completely. There wasn't much room for empathy or understanding. But what happened in those small prison camps, those moments of shared sound, were proof that even in the darkest conditions, humanity still finds cracks to shine through. Music became one of those cracks. It didn't fix the trauma, it didn't erase the guilt or the shame, but it gave the men something to hold on to, something human. One American guard later said, "That song, it made me realize they weren't my enemy anymore. Just men trying to survive the same madness I was." And for the Japanese POWs, it became a reminder of the night they stopped being ghosts. As Japan grew into a modern nation again, American music became a bridge between the two countries. Jazz festivals, cultural exchanges, and even friendships formed out of a shared love of the same sounds that once divided them. Most of the men from those camps are gone now. Their stories are scattered, a diary here, a line in a letter there, a memory passed down to a grandchild. But one thing remains constant. When they talked about the war, they always remembered the music. That moment in the camp wasn't about surrender, it wasn't about sides, it was about rediscovering what it meant to feel human again. In the next and final part, we'll bring it all together, the lesson, the reflection, and the message that still matters today. Because even though the war ended decades ago, that one night of music still whispers a truth the world keeps forgetting. Years later, when the war was long over and the world had moved on, some of those men were asked what they remembered most from their time as prisoners. Most didn't talk about the beatings or the hunger or the endless days of labor. They talked about the sound. They remembered that first night, the broken guitar, the radio crackle, the trumpet cutting through the silence. They remembered how it felt, standing behind barbed wire, listening to something they didn't understand but somehow felt completely. It wasn't about jazz or swing or even America. It was about a moment when the war stopped, even if just inside their own heads. And that's the strange thing about history. When we study World War II, we talk about armies, battles, bombs, and treaties. But we forget the small, fragile human things that happen in the cracks between all that destruction, the things that remind us what we're really fighting for. Music was one of those things. After the war, Japan became one of the biggest fans of American music in the world. Within a decade, jazz clubs popped up across Tokyo, Osaka, and Yokohama. Records of Glenn Miller, Duke Ellington, and Louis Armstrong filled shelves. To the new generation, it was just music. Cool, lively, fun. But to the men who'd once heard it for the first time behind barbed wire, it meant something deeper. For them, that sound carried ghosts, memories of war, of loss, of realizing that even enemies could create something beautiful. There's an old recording from a Japanese veteran who became a music teacher after the war. He said, "When I teach my students American songs, I tell them, this music once stopped a war in my heart." Think about that. Not a gun, not a speech, a song. One historian described it best. Propaganda can make you hate a person's face, but art makes you see their soul. That's what happened in those POW camps. For years, propaganda had blinded both sides. Americans saw the Japanese as fanatical killers, and the Japanese saw Americans as demons without honor. But when that first note played, both sides heard something that propaganda couldn't drown out: emotion. And emotion is universal. It's the one language you can't fake, you can't censor it, you can't ban it, and once it touches you, it stays. That's why the memory of that music never left those men. In one letter found in a museum archive, a former POW wrote to the family of an American guard he'd met in the camp. The letter was short, just a few lines. "I don't know your name, but I remember your song. It helped me remember that I was still alive." That letter was written almost 40 years after the war ended, 4 decades, and still the sound echoed. It's easy to forget how powerful small moments can be. We think history is made by leaders and armies, but sometimes it's made by something as simple as a shared melody drifting through the night. If you think about it, that story isn't really about World War II at all. It's about people, how fragile we are, how easily we can be turned against each other, and how quickly we can be reminded of our shared humanity through something pure. Music doesn't care about uniforms. It doesn't care about flags.
It doesn't even care about language. It's just feeling, wrapped in sound. And in that camp, surrounded by barbed wire and fear, it reminded a group of broken men that life still had something good left in it. Maybe that's why stories like this matter. Because even today, when the world feels divided again, when people shout louder than they listen, these old, quiet moments remind us what connection really looks like. A guitar with 4 strings, a jazz song on a dusty radio, and a few men, once enemies, standing under the same moon, realizing that for a few minutes, they're not so different after all. So, the next time you
hear a song from that era, maybe Glenn Miller's In the Mood or a slow Japanese ballad from the 1940s, remember this. Somewhere, decades ago, that same melody broke through fear and made soldiers stop fighting, if only inside their hearts. The war ended a long time ago, but the echo of that moment, that sound of understanding, never really died. Because history isn't just written in battles, sometimes it's written in the silence after the last note fades.